Long before the infamy of Pearl Harbor, a secret invasion was already in motion. It didn't start with a massive bombardment or the thunder of artillery, but with a quiet, desperate urgency. This is the forgotten story of how United States Marines invaded the sovereign nation of Iceland. It was a battle fought not against a visible enemy with rifles and tanks, but against the clock, the brutal North Atlantic weather, and the silent, ever-present threat of Nazi Germany. This was a fight to secure the most important shipping lanes of the war, a move that changed the course of the Battle of the Atlantic, and a secret that pulled America into the European conflict 5 months before it was officially at war. By the spring of 1941, Great Britain was fighting for its life. Nazi Germany had conquered the continent and now stood staring across the English Channel. Britain's only hope for survival was its lifeline to North America, a constant stream of convoys carrying food, fuel, weapons, and men on the perilous journey across the Atlantic. But this lifeline was bleeding. Beneath the waves, German U-boats, the infamous Wolfpacks, were taking a horrifying toll, turning the cold, grey waters into a graveyard of steel and men. The British Royal Navy was stretched to its absolute breaking point and was losing the Battle of the Atlantic. Both Winston Churchill in London and Franklin D. Roosevelt in Washington knew that if that lifeline was severed, Britain would fall. And if Britain fell, Hitler would control all of Europe. The key to this entire strategic puzzle was a desolate, sparsely populated island of volcanic rock and ice, sitting squarely in the middle of the North Atlantic shipping lanes. Iceland. Two military strategists, Iceland was the ultimate prize. It was an unsinkable aircraft carrier. From its shores, long-range patrol bombers could guard the convoys and hunt U-boats far out to sea. Its deep fjords could shelter the warships escorting the merchant fleets. In Allied hands, Iceland was the cork in the bottle, sealing off the German Navy's access to the wider Atlantic. But in Nazi hands, it would be a dagger pointed at the throat of the Allied lifeline. From Icelandic bases, German bombers and U-boats could roam the convoy routes at will. The Battle of the Atlantic would be lost. The Germans knew this. In Berlin, a plan was already on the drawing board, codenamed Operation Icarus, detailing a full-scale German invasion of Iceland. But German naval commanders were hesitant. Invading was one thing. Sustaining a force so far from home, right under the nose of the Royal Navy, was another. The plan was shelved, but not forgotten. It remained a constant, terrifying possibility. This possibility had already forced Britain's hand on May 10, 1940. As Germany was conquering Denmark, Iceland's parent nation Britain launched its own invasion, Operation Fork. 746 Royal Marines landed in Reykjavik, unopposed, much to the shock and protest of the neutral Icelandic government. Britain promised to respect Icelandic sovereignty, but the message was clear. They would rather occupy a friendly neutral than risk a German takeover. By 1941, however, the British garrison, which had swelled to over 25,000 men, was desperately needed elsewhere. The war in North Africa was raging, and the threat of a German invasion of Britain itself still loomed. Churchill looked across the Atlantic to the one man who could help, President Franklin D. Roosevelt. The request was simple and strategically vital. America needed to take over the defense of Iceland. In the White House, President Roosevelt faced one of the toughest decisions of his presidency. The United States was a nation deeply divided. A powerful isolationist movement argued passionately to keep America out of Europe's war. Roosevelt, a shrewd political operator, knew that any overt act of war could tear the country apart and be political suicide. But he was also a pragmatist. He knew Nazi Germany was an existential threat to American democracy, and that the fall of Britain would leave the U.S. facing a hostile, fascist-dominated world all alone. He was already walking a fine line. Through the Lend-Lease Act, he had made America the arsenal of democracy, supplying Britain with war materials. U.S. Navy ships were already patrolling the western Atlantic, reporting U-boat sightings to the British on undeclared and technically unneutral act of war. Taking over Iceland would be the most audacious step yet. It would mean placing American troops squarely in the European war zone, a de facto entry into the conflict. On paper, American foreign policy was all about neutrality, but the reality was that neutrality was a luxury the United States could no longer afford. Iceland could not be allowed to fall into German hands. Roosevelt made his decision. He would break the rule. What followed was a masterpiece of diplomatic maneuvering. The United States couldn't just invade a sovereign nation. That's what the bad guys did. So a delicate dance began between Washington, London, and Reykjavik. Churchill pressured the reluctant Icelandic government, which was still protesting the British presence. Prime Minister Herman Jónasson was in an impossible position. His country of just 120,000 people was caught between two giants. He feared a German occupation would be brutal, but an Allied one still violated the neutrality his people cherished. In the end, he wasn't given a real choice. An invitation was extended. This allowed Roosevelt to frame the operation not as an invasion, but as a protective deployment undertaken at the request of the Icelandic government. An agreement was signed. The United States recognized Iceland's independence, promised not to interfere in its internal affairs, and pledged to withdraw all forces at the end of the war. It was a brilliant piece of political theater, but beneath the niceties, the reality was stark. A neutral power was about to occupy another neutral power to preempt an attack from a third. For the men who would carry it out, it was an order unlike any other. They were United States Marines, and they were about to go to war 5 months before their country was ready to admit it. The men of the 6th Marine Regiment were training in the sun-drenched hills near San Diego, practicing amphibious assaults for a war they thought would be against Japan in the Pacific. They were a mix of seasoned vets and fresh-faced volunteers, guys who had joined the Corps for adventure during the lean years of the Great Depression. Then, in May 1941, a cryptic order arrived: pack your gear for a possible move to the East Coast. So, why the Marines? Because they were all volunteers. The U.S. Army was filled with draftees, and under the law at the time, draftees couldn't be sent overseas to a nation with which the U.S. wasn't at war. The Marines, as an all-volunteer expeditionary force, could be. Roosevelt had found his loophole. The 6th Marines boarded trains across the country to Charleston, South Carolina. There, they became the core of a new, hastily assembled unit, the 1st Provisional Marine Brigade. Under Brigadier General John Marston, the force grew to over 4,000 officers and men, complete with artillery, tanks, and anti-aircraft guns. They were a self-contained fighting force, ready for anything. Or so they thought. The loading of the ships in Charleston was a mess. It was rushed and haphazard, nothing like the fine-tuned operations that would come later in the war. Equipment was stowed wherever it would fit. No one knew their destination, but rumors swirled. The Azores, Martinique, somewhere in the Caribbean. On June 22, 1941, 6 transport ships slipped out of Charleston Harbor and headed north, escorted by the powerful Task Force 19, with 2 old battleships, 2 cruisers, and a screen of destroyers. This heavy escort made one thing clear: wherever they were going, there was danger. The convoy sailed to Argentia, Newfoundland, where they anchored and waited. Finally, on July 1st, the orders came. Destination: Iceland. As the task force steamed east, a new reality set in. They had officially entered the war zone. An order came down: all hands will wear life jackets at all times, even in their bunks. The tension skyrocketed. Lookouts scanned the horizon, not just for land, but for the periscope of a German U-boat. Then, they saw it, not an enemy sub, but the grim evidence of their work. The convoy passed through a debris field of splintered wood and oil slicks, the remains of merchant ships sent to the bottom. They were sailing through the very waters where, just weeks earlier, the German battleship Bismarck had sunk the pride of the Royal Navy, HMS Hood. This wasn't a drill. This was the Battle of the Atlantic, and they were now right in the middle of it. On the evening of July 7th, 1941, Task Force 19 arrived off the coast of Reykjavik. The scene was surreal. It was nearly midnight, yet the sun hung low on the horizon, casting a strange glow over the landscape. It was the Arctic summer's famous midnight sun. The sea was calm. The air was still. There were no searchlights, no air raid sirens, no coastal artillery. Just silence. This was not an assault, but an arrival. 2 transports pulled directly alongside the main quay, and the Marines just walked down the gangplanks onto Icelandic soil. Other ships anchored offshore, ferrying men and equipment to a small, pebbly beach. There was no opposition, no shots fired. A few civilians gathered to stare at the men in their green uniforms. The Icelandic government issued a formal protest, but it also told its people not to interfere. Pragmatism had won out over pride. The Marines, with no help from local labor, immediately began the grueling task of unloading their ships. It was a logistical nightmare. They worked around the clock, manhandling crates, vehicles, and ammo onto the shore. By July 12th, the disembarkation was complete. While supplies were coming ashore, combat units moved swiftly to secure their objectives. This was the invasion. They weren't seizing ground from an enemy, but taking control of the island's vital infrastructure to deny it to a potential one. Marines secured the port, the airfields, and the radio station. They set up checkpoints and began mapping out defensive positions. The British troops on the island were visibly relieved. These Marines were their replacements. The British commander handed over responsibility, and the 1st Provisional Marine Brigade became a mobile reserve force ready to counterattack a German landing wherever it might happen. Irony. They had so few vehicles, they weren't really mobile at all. Most of their movements would be on foot. This was a secret battle, won not by firepower, but by foresight. It was an invasion where the main enemy was poor port facilities and logistical chaos. The Marines had taken control of the most strategic piece of real estate in the North Atlantic without a single casualty in combat. The hard part, they would soon discover, was just beginning. Now, they had to live there. The battle for Iceland was over. The war for survival had just begun. For the next 8 months, the Marines fought a new enemy, the island itself. Their new homes were Nisson huts, drafty, damp, corrugated steel tubes, heated by coal stoves that offered a tiny circle of warmth in a sea of cold. The Marines set up camps with familiar names like Camp Main Street, trying to bring some sense of order to the barren, alien landscape. As the short summer faded, the days grew shorter with alarming speed. Bilateutum, the sun would peek out for only a few hours before plunging the island back into a long, dark night. The weather was a constant, oppressive force. Gale-force winds howled across the treeless plains, and a miserable mix of rain, sleet, and snow seemed to be the default setting. A permanent, pungent smell of fish from local processing plants permeated everything. The diet was monotonous, and for many, it was miserable. The island had an abundance of sheep, and soon the Marines were served mutton in every form imaginable. Boiled mutton, roasted mutton, mutton stew. They grew to despise it. Life settled into a grinding routine of constant training. They ran weapons, drills, went on long, grueling marches across volcanic rock, and built up their camps. Liberty was rare. Reykjavik, a city of only 38,000 people, was overwhelmed by tens of thousands of foreign troops. For entertainment, they had movies in mess halls, dog-eared magazines from home, and their own ingenuity. During the long, dark nights, many Marines became skilled craftsmen, building furniture for their huts out of old supply crates. For these young Americans, many from warm climates, Iceland felt like another planet. It was a world of profound isolation, crushing boredom, and a constant, draining battle against the cold. They were standing guard against an enemy they never saw, on a forgotten front line of the war. Their quiet, unglamorous struggle was every bit as vital as any battle being fought in the deserts of Africa or the skies over Britain. For the 120,000 citizens of Iceland, the arrival of first the British and then the Americans was a profound shock. A fiercely independent people, they suddenly found their neutral island occupied by tens of thousands of foreign soldiers. The official government line was one of protest, but pragmatic cooperation. After all, a Nazi occupation would be far worse. Initially, relations were tense. When the Americans arrived, they were seen as a slight improvement over the British. As one observer noted, the U.S. Marines seemed tidier, more attractive, and notably wealthier. The occupation, which some Icelanders came to call the Blessed War, brought an unprecedented economic boom. The construction of roads, hospitals, and airfields provided jobs and injected huge amounts of cash into the sleepy economy. Reykjavik transformed into a bustling hub, but this prosperity came with social friction. The presence of so many young, foreign men in a small, conservative society created tension. The most controversial issue was the relationship between troops and local Icelandic women. In what became known as a standio, or the situation, a moral panic swept the nation. Women who associated with soldiers were often ostracized. In reality, most relationships were consensual, and some 332 Icelandic women would eventually marry foreign soldiers. But the social upheaval was real. The Icelanders themselves were not immune to the dangers of the war. An estimated 200 Icelandic sailors lost their lives in attacks by German U-boats. They were, in their own way, casualties of the Battle of the Atlantic that the Marines had been sent to help win. So while no pitched battles were fought on Icelandic soil, a different kind of struggle played out, a cultural one. It was an awkward, sometimes tense, but ultimately necessary alliance. Both sides understood the strategic reality. This small, rocky island was a bastion against a shared enemy, and its defense was paramount. The Marines' quiet watch in the North Atlantic came to an abrupt end on December 7, 1941. The attack on Pearl Harbor plunged the United States fully into World War II. The secret war was over. The real war had begun. With the U.S. now officially a combatant, the legal restrictions on deploying draftees overseas were gone. The decision was made to replace the specialized Marine Brigade with larger U.S. Army formations. Starting in early 1942, troop ships carrying Army soldiers began arriving in the American presence would swell to over 30,000 personnel. The mission of the 1st Provisional Marine Brigade was complete. They had been the tip of the spear, the force that secured the island during America's precarious neutrality. By March 1942, the last of the Marines departed. Many would be transferred to the Pacific, where they would trade the bitter Arctic cold for the sweltering heat of islands like Guadalcanal and Saipan, fighting the kind of war they had originally trained for. The consequences of this forgotten invasion were profound. For Iceland, the occupation was a catalyst for full independence, which it formally declared in 1944. For the war effort, securing Iceland was a strategic masterstroke that helped turn the tide of the Battle of the Atlantic, and for the United States, occupying Iceland was a pivotal moment. It was a bold, preemptive move that signaled Roosevelt's commitment to defeating Nazism long before the country was officially at war. The American military presence in Iceland didn't end with Germany's surrender. The naval air station at Keflavik became a cornerstone of NATO's defense during the Cold War, a vital outpost for monitoring Soviet submarines in the same waters the Marines had once patrolled. It was a direct line from the secret invasion of 1941. In 1941, the established rule of international conduct said that a neutral nation does not invade another neutral nation, but in the frigid waters of the North Atlantic, that rule it was broken by the cold calculation that the survival of democracy outweighed the diplomatic niceties of neutrality. The secret invasion of Iceland wasn't a battle of bullets and bombs. It was a battle of position, logistics, and will. It was a strategic chess move that checkmated a potential Nazi gambit before it was even played. By placing a few thousand Marines on a remote, volcanic rock, the United States secured the Allied lifeline, denied Germany a critical base, and irrevocably committed itself to the fight against Hitler. It was a quiet, forgotten battle that fundamentally changed the map of the war and set the stage for America's role in the world for the rest of the 20th century. If this story mattered to you, and you believe these forgotten histories deserve to be told, please consider liking this video and subscribing. And let us know in the comments where you're watching from. It's always incredible to see how far these stories travel. Thanks for watching.